Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Bob Murphy about the Great Depression and the New Deal. Dr. Murphy is a research assistant professor at the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He is the author of several books, including his most recent book, Choice, Cooperation, Enterprise, and Human Action, and, especially relevant for today's topic, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. He is a co-host of the Contra Krugman podcast, which you can find at contrakrugman.com, with Contra spelled with a C. You can also follow his work at consultingbyRPM.com. You can find him on Facebook under Robert Murphy and on Twitter at BobMurphyEcon. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-depression. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Well, thank you very much for joining me. So before we get started and before we look at some of the causes of the Great Depression and what some of the solutions might have been, and before we look at some of the specific programs that were part of the New Deal, let's just start out with some basic definitions in case anyone is unaware, or maybe there's someone listening who does not live in the United States. So when we say the Great Depression and when we say the New Deal, what do we mean? What do those terms mean?
Sure. So the Great Depression refers to, in the minds of the public, it refers to basically the 1930s and how it was just an awful economic situation in the United States and Europe, around the world. Economists get a little bit more specific that there was a sharp contraction from 1929 to 1933, and I'm talking about the United States, and then there was a fairly brisk, what seemed to be a recovery, and then there was another big collapse in 1937 and 38. All right, so depending on the general public versus economic historians, you can get more or less specific. But basically, the entire world was suffering from what was in modern times the worst economy ever in the 1930s. So that's what the Great Depression is. The New Deal refers to the policy prescription that Franklin D. Roosevelt brought in. So he was elected in the 1932 election, and then was sworn into office as the U.S. president in early 33. And then the New Deal was his signature set of programs that greatly expanded what the role of the federal government had been in the United States at that point. So the federal government engaging in all sorts of activities to try to regulate the financial sector and to help the unemployed and boost employment and so forth. So things that nowadays seem standard to Americans, but was introduced during the Roosevelt administration.
Sure. So just how bad was the Great Depression? Are there any statistics or anecdotes in particular that you'd like to point to explain just how horrible of an economic situation it was?
Well, sure. The national unemployment rate, the way they measured it back then, got up to about 25%. So that gives you some indication of just how horrible it was. The various measures of industrial output and so forth fell greatly. Again, the major contraction was from 1929 to 33. Thousands of commercial banks failed. There were massive bank runs in the early 1930s. So the public would go to the bank to get their money out, and the bank would just close its doors. So I think that's just to give you a sense. Another idea was, I think it's even as late as maybe by like depending on what you looked at, like by the mid 1930s, that per capita GDP had not even recovered to the 1929 levels. And then if you just look at even private GDP per capita, even in the middle of World War II, it was lower than it had been in the early 1930s. Right, so by various measures, this was just a horrible, horrible time for the U.S. economy.
All right, so let's look at what immediately preceded the Great Depression. So you had the Roaring Twenties in the decade or so prior to the ensuing crash and the onset of the Great Depression. What exactly was the Roaring Twenties, and what did the years and decade or so prior to the Depression look like?
Sure. So the Roaring Twenties is the name the historians gave the U.S. Originally there was in the 1920 and 21, there actually was another depression. using that term in the technical sense. But after that, the U.S. economy enjoyed a brisk growth. There was a lot of genuine prosperity, I would say, in the 20s. Households were getting, electricity and so forth. Lots of consumer products were becoming available. It became more popular, people were going to the movies and things of this nature. So a lot of progress was made, stuff that, nowadays we would take for granted, but back then were things that were being introduced to households for the first time. So a lot of that happened in the 20s. And again, the phrase they gave was the Roaring Twenties. There was also a giant rise in the U.S. stock market, which famously, of course, crashed in 1929.
Sure. All right. Now, I want to spend the next portion of the interview looking at what brought about the Depression and what some of the explanations are that some people offer up to explain what happened and look at what some of the factors might have been. So, first of all, what would you say brought about the Depression? What would be your explanation, and what role did the Federal Reserve play in the onset of the Great Depression? Okay,
sure. So I consider myself a member of what's called the Austrian School of Economics, right? So it's just a school of thought. And generally the Austrians, they think the boom-bust cycle in the market economy is driven by the commercial banking system, and then when there's a central bank like the Federal Reserve, that the Fed is the chief culprit. And so Murray Rothbard wrote a book called America's Great Depression. Murray Rothbard is one of the leaders in the Austrian school, and I subscribe to his theory in my popular book, popular press book that you mentioned. I endorse Rothbard's explanation. So what the Austrians say on this particular issue is that to understand why was there this big crash in 29 and why did unemployment go up so much in the early 30s, why did the U.S. economy seem to hit this wall, they said to understand that you need to look at the preceding boom. And so that in particular, the Federal Reserve had an easy money policy, particularly from 1926 onward, and that sort of blew up an asset bubble and sort of caused this unsustainable boom in the U.S. economy that ultimately came crashing down. So that's the basic story as to why was there a huge economic correction necessary in the early 30s, but then to understand, okay, but why didn't the U.S. economy, have the big crash and then bounce back like it had done previously, right? Because this wasn't the first business cycle in the U.S. There had been lots of crises or panics, they called them, and, they could be sharp and bad for a few years, but then things would turn around. Why did the 1930s just linger on in this decade long of agony? And I would say that was because of first what Herbert Hoover did and then what Franklin Roosevelt did. So the crash had to happen because of what the Fed did in the 20s. But I would say the reason you just lingered and had this awful economy for a full decade was because of the huge expansion and what the federal government was doing.
Okay, yeah. So aside from just the Fed's role, what were some of the other factors that brought about the Depression that were direct causes of federal government actions and policies? And yes, I know we could get into the minutia of whether the Fed is a part of the federal government and how it's quasi-private and whatnot, but forgetting about that, other than the Fed, what are some of the federal government policies and actions that helped bring about the crash and the ensuing Depression?
Okay, well, if I had to I think the single most important thing to understand why is it that this was so qualitatively worse than what had happened before is that, and this might sound funny to some of your listeners if they've never heard this narrative before, but we've been, certainly in the United States, we were taught that Herbert Hoover was this laissez-faire president who just, remained aloof and said, no, it's not the federal government's job to try to help the economy when things are bad and the Constitution prohibits it and I just got to sit here and twiddle my thumb. And no, it's the exact opposite, that Herbert Hoover, as he said in his own autobiographical works talking about this period, and as the facts demonstrate, he wasn't lying. He wasn't just spinning a narrative to save his reputation. He was the most interventionist U.S. president in U.S. history to that point. I mean, so FDR was more interventionist than Hoover was, but that was just because he upped the ante. FDR did it. Hoover did way more than any previous U.S. president to try to use the power of the federal government to help an economy that was down. So the single worst thing that he did is he, right after the stock market crash in 29, so Herbert Hoover is the president at this point, he calls in all the big business leaders and urges them not to cut wage rates, right? Because Hoover had this theory that if you were that the economy could sort of fall into this vicious downward spiral where there's a panic, consumers stop spending money, so businesses see their sales drop, and then the businesses try to respond to that by laying off workers or doing wage cuts. Oh, but wait a minute, if the workers aren't getting paid and they're getting laid off, then they can't buy products, and so then sales fall even further. And so Hoover had this idea that you could nip that in the bud. If you could just tell all the businesses, hey, even though your sales are dropping, just keep wages high and don't lay anybody off, and then we'll nip this thing in the bud. And so that's what he did. And so when you're looking at the statistics to try to figure out, what was going on here, why did unemployment get up to a shocking 25%, I would say the single most important factor is that real wages went up very high, right? Because what was happening is, in general, prices were falling, but yet businesses weren't cutting wage rates the way wage rates had fallen in previous situations like this. So labor was becoming more and more expensive compared to everything else. So if you just think about it, if what you're trying to do is get businesses to hire more workers when a business fails and workers lose their job, and you want them to get hired by other businesses, the last thing in the world you want to do is keep labor artificially expensive. And yet that's exactly what Hoover's policy ended up doing, because again, he was telling businesses, don't slash the amount you pay per hour to your workers, even though the prices of everything else were falling. And if you want, we can get into why was that happening. But so that's I think the most important thing that Hoover did that was different from his predecessors in previous recessions. And I give statistics of this in my book. Prices would fall, but so would wages. And so workers were able, unemployment might spike, but then it would quickly drop and workers could get hired again because they became cheaper. And then so businesses were willing to hire them. But whereas in the 1929 to 1933, even as prices in general were plummeting, wage rates were not falling nearly as fast as they used to, I would argue largely because of what Hoover was doing.
Okay, and another policy of the Hoover administration was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. So what was that, and what role did that possibly play? Sure.
So your listeners might remember this. There's the funny scene in, Ferris Bueller's Day Off when...
Oh, yes, great movie.
Yeah, he's, the Hawley Smoot Tariff. All right, anyone? Bueller? Yeah. So that's where Ben Stein talks about this. So, yeah, it was passed in 1930. And it was a protectionist measure which greatly increased tariff rates, right? So sort of cut off the United States from international, well, not cut it off, but made it more expensive for imports to come into the United States. And then that set off a trade war where other countries reciprocated and, raised tariffs against the United States. So this happened in 1930. So already, this is after the stock market crash had occurred and the economy was starting to go into a tailspin. And so the last thing in the world you would want to do in this situation is all of a sudden increase taxes. And just remember that tariffs, even though they're levied on foreign goods, and so they have something to do with international trade, they are an example of taxes. You're making it more expensive for U.S. consumers to buy products. And so the last thing you want to do when the economy's already on the ropes is to massively jack up taxes. And it wasn't just the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. It was also just in general, later on, the Hoover administration really sharply increased tax rates because they ran big budget deficits for a while. That didn't work. The economy kept plummeting, and so then they chickened out. And Hoover's advisors convinced them, okay, yeah, we tried to stimulate the economy through running deficits. That's not working. Now you got to shore up the budget. And so instead of cutting spending, the primary mechanism by which they tried to close the budget gap was by massively increasing taxes. And so, again, this idea that Herbert Hoover was this small government guy is not correct.
Well, no, it's not. But some people who are trying to evaluate the situation might point to the Harding and Coolidge administrations prior to Hoover's, and I think we could probably say that they were both more small government types than Hoover was. And a lot of these people will point to the tax cuts of the 1920s, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, playing a role in that. They might place the onus on him for those tax cuts. What's the truth about those tax cuts, and did they play any role in bringing about the Depression? What are people getting wrong whenever they bring up the tax cuts in trying to explain the Great Depression?
Well, sure. So let me just give some specifics here. I was just double-checking the numbers here. So to give you an idea of just how big of a tax hike Hoover implemented, in 1931, the top marginal income tax rate was 25%. And then 1 year later, in 1932, the top marginal income tax rate had jumped up to 63%. Okay, so again, imagine that. This is in the midst of the Great Depression, and from 1931 to 1932. Let me just repeat that. The top bracket's income tax rate originally was 25%, and then it jumped up to 63% 1 year later. So you can just, that boggles the mind. If they did that in a normal economy, that by itself would have caused a massive recession. And yet they implemented this going into 1932. So, while the economy was already suffering tremendously. So that's the kind of stuff that Herbert Hoover did. So by no means should people believe with the narrative they may have learned in growing up in school that Herbert Hoover sat back and did nothing and the economy on its own weight collapsed. No, that's not true. So as far as Andrew Mellon, yes, he was the Treasury Secretary. He actually, he was under Coolidge, and then also so Harding and Coolidge, and then also was in the under Herbert Hoover. And Mellon's, see, just the backstory here is in World War I, marginal income tax rates had gotten up to really high levels, all right, to try to finance the war effort. And so they were up at 73% was the highest that the top rate was. Well, actually, it was, I'm just scrolling back here in my notes. It was up at 77% as of 1918. Okay. And so then after the war, Andrew Mellon had this idea, which nowadays we would call supply side economics, right? So this is like the stuff that they did in the early Reagan years way back then. And he had this idea saying, these really high income tax rates are counterproductive, that it just causes investors to keep their money locked up in tax-free assets. And so if we brought down these really confiscatory rates from such high levels, that the Treasury won't even possibly lose money, right? Because people will then move their assets into taxable things. And so even though we're getting a lower percentage because we're cutting the rate, we might grow the tax base so much. So that was the theory. And yes, over a few years through the early to mid 1920s, they did bring the income tax rate down substantially. So like I said, it had been up at 77% in the middle of World War I. And then they gradually brought it down in steps such that it was 25% by the year 1925. Okay, so that's a pretty substantial drop. And this coincided with the Roaring Twenties. So you're right. There is a school of thought that says, oh, these tax cuts were irresponsible and just caused the rich people to go out and get a bunch of money, and they pumped up the economy, and then it came crashing down. I don't buy that story. I think that that the tax cuts were good, that they helped explain a lot of the genuine prosperity of the 1920s, that return resources to the private sector, lower the penalty on earning income, and people go out and earn more income, and that what caused the unsustainable boom and then crash was loose Federal Reserve policy of the 20s.
Sure, and a couple of other policies that some might suggest helped lead to the Great Depression that I want you to touch on here. One would be the connection between the dollar and gold at the time, and another one would be the deflation that had taken place and that some claim was still taking place, and would suggest that helped lead to the Depression. So what's the truth about the role of gold and the role of deflation?
Okay, sure. Great question. So this gets pretty complicated, so I'll try to give short answers just to lay out the respective positions, and then you can take us into greater specificity if you want. So here, actually, it's not just a division among like free market economists who favor smaller government and then big government Keynesian economists. That here, actually, the Austrian school is distinguished even from the Chicago school, which that's associated like with Milton Friedman, people like that, which is also typically tends to be free market. But on this particular question of the role of monetary policy and gold and so forth in the Great Depression, Milton Friedman, with his co-author Anna Schwartz, actually had a very influential book that came out, and they argued and eventually got a lot of economists to agree with them. They said that one of the main problems of what happened in the Great Depression and why did things get so bad was that there was massive monetary contraction from 1929 to 1933, and that the Fed was sort of asleep at the wheel, or the Fed didn't do enough to offset it, and so that's why the economy fell off a cliff, and that's why, like, for example, consumer prices fell so much, which, like I told you several minutes ago, when you couple the fact that wage rates stayed they didn't fall very quickly in dollar terms, and then the price of everything else was collapsing, that made labor artificially really expensive. So as far as, why was there this deflation, remember what the U.S. Commercial banking system is what's called a fractional-reserve basis. And so when you go and put $100 in your checking account, the bank doesn't take that $100 bill and go put it in a vault with your name on it, obviously. They lend out a lot of that typically. And so at any given time, there's more – Americans think they have more money in the bank collectively than there's actually currency in the banks to back up all those deposits, if you will. And so because of that situation, if the public starts worrying about a particular bank, there can be what's called a run on the bank. And so if the bank, if all the customers of a bank collectively think they have $1 billion in checkbook deposits, right? So you think that, your ATM says you have $1,000 and other people think they have 5,000, and you add it up, and collectively all these banks' customers think they got $1 billion in there, but really there's only $400 million in currency in the vault of this bank, and so the public shows up, cleans the bank out, takes out the $400 million, and then the bank folds. There's a sense in which $600 million just disappeared from the economy, right? Because the public thought they had $1 billion, and then all of a sudden now they only think they have $400 million. So that's what was happening in the early 30s when there was all these bank runs, and that's the sense in which the quantity of money measured in dollars in the U.S. was shrinking. And so Milton Friedman and many economists nowadays think, what the Fed should have done is they should have come in and pumped more money in from the top to try to offset that so that the total amount of money didn't shrink. And part of what constrained the Fed was that they were on the gold standard at that point. And so a lot of economists today would say, yes, back then the Fed's hands were tied because the dollar was tied to gold. They couldn't just inflate, totally at their discretion, because ultimately if they printed too many dollars, then the public would keep turning them in for gold and the Fed would run out of gold. And so the Fed's hands were tied, and so they kind of had to do these lackluster moves as the bank runs occurred. So that's one theory. I disagree with that, but yes, that is the sense in which some economists think the gold standard had something to do with the severity of the Great Depression.
All right. Now, earlier you obviously explained your theory, and there you just got into what Milton Friedman said and what Chicago school economists might say as their theory. But what are some of the other theories? What would be the general Keynesian view? What would be some of the other explanations, and where do these explanations run into problems?
Okay, sure. So the standard Keynesian view, I think they would agree with, the Friedmanite explanation insofar as it goes, and certainly the Keynesians and Chicago school types would say that when FDR came in and took the dollar off of gold in early 1933, and then there was this temporary recovery, where the economy seemed to be on an upswing after he did that, they would say, yep, see, it was the the gold standard constraining what the Fed could do. What the economy needed was more stimulus. But where the Keynesians differ from the Chicago school, the Chicago school thinks that's all it would take. As long as monetary policy had been better, then things would have been fine. Whereas the Keynesians say, no, the real problem was a collapse in aggregate demand. And sure, the monetary authorities could have helped with that, but ultimately it took real huge deficit spending to fix things. And that's why the Keynesians would continue. We didn't fully get out of the Depression until World War II, when the government just threw open the floodgates and started borrowing and spending money like crazy, and we had these enormous deficits. All right, so that's the standard Keynesian story. So why I think that that's an inadequate explanation is that, for one thing, Herbert Hoover did let the budget deficit grow. Okay, so by the last fiscal year, going from July of 32 to June of 33, that's how they did the budget of the fiscal years back then. So this was like the last fiscal year that you could attribute to Herbert Hoover. There, the budget deficit was 4.5% of the economy. Right, so it wasn't enormous, but it wasn't as if Hoover had a tight fiscal policy back then in terms of looking at if you were cared about the size of budget deficits. And so to try to explain why was the Great Depression so bad, it doesn't make sense to say, oh, it was because of Herbert Hoover's tight-fisted austerity, because Herbert Hoover was a better Keynesian than any previous U.S. president had been, right? So he wasn't as good a Keynesian as FDR would be, but it doesn't make sense to say, ultimately the explanation for why was the Great Depression so bad is that Herbert Hoover didn't spend enough, because that sort of raises the question, okay, well then how come previous presidents who were much tighter with their monetary or their fiscal policy, why didn't they have the Great Depression on their watch? All right, so that's one thing. Also, just I don't think it's worth getting into the numbers here, but FDR did not increase the budget deficit that much in his first administration compared to what had been under Hoover. So when today's Keynesians try to say, FDR came in and he was willing to have the red ink flow more loosely, and that's why the economy turned around under him, whereas it had plummeted under Hoover, that the numbers just to me don't add up. That, Hoover had moderately big deficits and Roosevelt's initially were bigger, and that's supposed to be the difference between the worst economy in U.S. history, and then it turns around on a dime. To me, that doesn't make any sense. The numbers don't just add up. I think you have to look elsewhere for the explanation.
All right, and one term you used in your answer there is aggregate demand. So in case someone listening doesn't know what that is, can you give a brief definition of that term?
Oh, sure. So that's a very Keynesian term from Keynesian economic analysis. So aggregate demand, loosely speaking, just means how much total spending is there in the economy. And so Keynesian economists, when there's a recession, often diagnose that by saying, for whatever reason, consumers and businesses are not spending enough on consumption and investment, and so there's a shortfall in total spending. There's not enough total spending or aggregate demand for products to provide full employment, and so they say in a situation like that where the market demand has dropped for some reason, until the market can be rehabilitated and we can get private spending back up, then there's a role for the government to step in and for the government to spend money and fill that void.
All right. Now, we've obviously looked at some of the different government policies that some attribute to the onset of the Great Depression, and we talked about the Austrian and the Keynesian and the Chicago School views of what brought about the Great Depression. But there are many, many more explanations. Are there any other explanations that particularly stand out that you think are worth mentioning and refuting?
I think the other more eclectic views would just be combinations of those three major camps that I just mentioned. So for example, I know that Jude Wanniski, who was one of the architects of the supply side revolution in the 80s, in his book, I think it was called How the World Works, something like that, he put a lot of emphasis on the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, all right, which you and I have discussed. And so he said that what happened is, because you might say, wait a minute, isn't there an issue of cause and effect, that the stock market crashed in 29 and certainly the Great Depression was underway by the time the Smoot-Hawley Tariff even went into effect, signed in 1930. But what Wanniski said is that, if you look at the movements in the U.S. stock market, when Congress was debating that Smoot-Hawley Tariff, you could see that stocks were responding based on the latest news as to whether this thing was going to pass or not. And so Winitsky was saying it was, the ultimate reason for the 29 crash, or a large part of it, was investors were sort of looking forward and realizing, this thing's a done deal, and once these tariff rates gets jacked up, then, things are going to be bad. And so they were just rationally, pricing in that information ahead of time. So, I think it's a clever theory. To me, I don't think the Smoot-Hawley tariff was big enough by itself to cause the U.S. economy to flip from being the Roaring Twenties to all of a sudden, the worst economy in U.S. history. To me, the Smoot-Hawley tariff by itself was not a big enough catalyst for that kind of a flip. And there's, I should probably mention, there's lots of other, people who like Minsky, for example, like people stressing psychology, and they might look at the leverage in the banking and real estate sectors and sort of say, there was this big bubble that blew up and eventually it had to pop. And so, all that kind of stuff is valid, but I don't think they have a really good causal story as to, okay, but why did this bubble get so big? And then why did it pop when it did, that sort of thing. So a lot of these things, various strands of thought, I could endorse some pieces of the explanation or reject others. But to me, I think that ultimately it's a story of the Fed blowing up the asset bubble in the 20s, and then that necessitated a crash. And then the reason the crash didn't quickly get cleansed out of the system was that the federal government came in and did all sorts of interventions that in previous administrations they really would have just stood back and let the market fix itself.
All right, sure. Now, earlier you talked about Herbert Hoover and his role in the Great Depression and into the Great Depression getting as bad as it did. How would you describe Franklin Roosevelt's role in prolonging the Depression?
Oh, he was awful. It was under Franklin Roosevelt's administration. If you want to say when was the U.S. government the closest to outright central planning in peacetime, it would be the New Deal era, the 30s when Roosevelt was in charge. And then you could say, okay, when in any case was it the closest to outright central planning? I think that would be World War II, which again in the beginning was under Franklin Roosevelt. So if you just think of it that way, if you have any respect for the market economy at all, and if you have any acknowledgement of the fact that socialism doesn't work as an economic system, well, is it any wonder that when Franklin Roosevelt took the U.S. economy the closest to socialism that it had ever been, that we had the worst economy in U.S. history, right? So it's this weird thing where if you like Franklin Roosevelt, you're going to look at the historical record and say, the economy would have just kept plummeting more and more and more if it weren't for FDR, who came in and then, pulled it around. And thank goodness after he had been in office for 8 years, the economy went back to being halfway okay. Whereas I would say, no, looking at previous examples of boom bust cycles, typically the economy, would have a bad crash, but then it would bounce back. And, 3-4 years after the crash, things were back to normal. And yet somehow FDR comes in 1933, and yet unemployment is still in double digits, 1940, so 7 years later, the unemployment rate is still in double digits, right? And so it's sort of like, what more would FDR have to do for people to think he prolonged the Great Depression rather than, quote, getting us out of it?
Right. So earlier you defined the New Deal for us, and obviously the New Deal is sort of the centerpiece of FDR's response to the Great Depression. A lot of people will claim that the policies that made up the New Deal and the programs that went along with those policies fit into the buckets of relief, recovery, and reform, and that's a way that that sort of mainstream historians might use to classify the New Deal in some settings. But what would you say were the major parts of the New Deal and of what it consisted?
Well, sure. So, I think the big thing was that in terms of, from an economist perspective, is that it engaged in massive cartelization, right? So the forming of cartels, that the National Industrial Relations Board and these things, they would come in like the big businesses in a given sector would fix prices. They would come up with lists of prices for the goods and services that were in their sector. And then it was literally illegal for like smaller competitors that didn't have the name brand recognition to undersell the big boys in a given industry. In the book, I give the broad statistics for this stuff, but I also give some anecdotes about like a tire manufacturer who couldn't compete with the national chain. He couldn't offer the kind of service they could because they didn't have all the locations all over the country and whatever. And so how could he get people to buy his brand of tire? Well, he would charge a lower price than the national, company brand would. And that was literally illegal under the New Deal, in the early stages. So things of that, there's other examples where they had codes of conduct and when you could run your business. And so there would be like, I put another anecdote in there where some tailor was sewing a pair of pants at night in his factory with the lights off because he knew it was against the code. And then the guys in trench coats literally would kick down the door and come in and pull him out. And he, the authorities would accost him and whatever and go through his books because you weren't allowed to do that. Now you say, what's the rationale? Well, the ultimate rationale was they thought, okay, we had this ruinous competition, this cutthroat competition of the market economy run amok where the economy's bad. And so all the individual businesses try to respond by cutting prices, cutting wages, and, working harder. And don't we realize collectively that's suicide? And so what we need to do is just rationally restrict output, maintain our prices at a higher level so that we can all earn a living. That was the idea. And so it was very anti-consumer and pro-big business. And I mean, this culminated in the absurdities of in agriculture, where they would literally agents from the federal government would go around and would have animal mules or whatever turn up the plowing. They would slaughter baby pigs. They would douse oranges with gasoline and things like this. So ironically, a lot of the scenes in The Grapes of Wrath, that famous Steinbeck novel, where Steinbeck erroneously thought it was pure laissez-faire market forces that were leading farmers to destroy food when there was people starving, that wasn't the free market. That was literally federal government policy doing that. And again, the theory was, oh wait, if we restrict, destroy some of the crop, then the farmers can raise prices and earn a decent living. Whereas if they just dump everything on the market, then prices are going to collapse and the farmers are all going to be broke. So that was the theory, but yet you had this absurdity where people are going hungry and literally the federal government is going around destroying food.
Well, no, it was just ridiculous and outrageous. And, of course, the National Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which you referenced in that answer, were just two of the outrageous aspects and programs that went along with the New Deal. So what were some of the other ridiculous and what we might even say insane parts of this whole program?
I mean, there was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation received initial funding, I think, of over $1 billion to go around and recapitalize failing banks and other financial institutions, things of that nature. And this was actually set up under Hoover, right? So again, things that a lot of the public would have thought would have been something that would be quintessentially something FDR would have done. And yet actually a lot of it was Herbert Hoover. Public works programs, again, this is, the Hoover Dam, for example, that was after Herbert Hoover. Now, in fairness, that was a project that had, that was not purely a public works project because of the Great Depression. That was something where, the wheels had been in motion beforehand. But nonetheless, that's just a good example of, to show that this idea that Herbert Hoover was this laissez-faire guy, was not true. He started, in fact, in the book, I have a quote from somebody who was one of the, Roosevelt's inner circle, a member of the New Deal. I don't know if it was formerly part of the Brain Trust per se, but, one of the lieutenants in the Roosevelt administration. And he admitted in the late 30s that, yeah, all the major things we did, the components of the New Deal, they all had their genesis under Hoover. We wouldn't have, we didn't admit that obviously when we were running against him during the campaign, but yeah, he started all the stuff and we just upped the ante. So all these things, the public works, WPA and things, that the rationale was, so that would fall under the, relief and recovery. The rationale being that we have people out of work. And so what do you got to do? Well, they need to eat first of all, but also we want to give them money so they go out and spend. And so, rightly or wrongly, at that time, there was still a stigma against just pure welfare. And so rather than just sending people checks that they would then cash and, go to the store or whatever. It was like, okay, well, give these guys something to do, these former breadwinners who now can't find work, even if it's not very productive, right? So just, have them go build schools or go pick up litter or do something, plant trees to give them a job. But it wasn't that what they were doing was productive in any, in terms of economic efficiency. It was, really a rationale just to get money into their hands so that they could support their family and so on. But that was a lot of what was going. And then also too, you have strict regulations of the financial sector. The theory being it was the unregulated wildcat Wall Street and commercial banking system that led us to this problem, and so we need tighter controls. They also brought in FDIC at this point, thinking, part of what happened was there were all these bank runs because the public was worried about the banks not having their money. So if we have federal deposit insurance for checking accounts, the public will say, the federal government's backstopping my commercial checking account, so I don't need to go run on the bank because I know Uncle Sam's got me in case the bank goes under. So the idea was, what can we do to put in place so that the public doesn't, so that this doesn't happen again. So all sorts of massive interventions in just about every sector of the economy you can think of.
Well, and one intervention that's still around today, and most people today probably wouldn't consider this outrageous or ridiculous, but Social Security is a program that was established during that time and is still around. How did Social Security fit into the New Deal, and how are we still suffering, could we say, from the New Deal and the policies that were developed during that time?
Well, sure, you're exactly right. So the Social Security Act itself was signed by Roosevelt in 1935, and so here, part of the idea was that, you have to realize that there were billions of Americans who were all of a sudden destitute, that they had been taken care of by, their children or what have you, or they might have had retirement funds in the banks, or they might have held stocks or what have you, and then things collapsed. And so there were a lot of people who, as of 1928, were fine, and then, as of the early 30s, now all of a sudden were completely destitute. And so that's part of the function of what the Social Security Act was just to provide a formal mechanism by which people who were really in dire straits, how could they be provided with relief? But then more generally going forward, the idea was a paternalistic, hey, clearly people left to their own devices in a voluntary market setting don't have the foresight to provide for their old age and their retirement. And so if we as a society are going to decide, we're at a standard of living that in a development of civilization where we're not going to let that happen. We're not just going to let millions of elderly people just die on us. So we know the government's going to step in and prevent that. So given that we're going to do that, we have to now force people to contribute for their retirement, because otherwise we'll get freeloaders or people who just take risks thinking, the taxpayer will take care of me when I'm older. So I think that was part of the rationale, was to say we're going to force people to put money set aside money for their retirement, take it out of their paychecks every pay period, and then we won't let them be able to touch it, right? That the government's going to take it, and the government's going to say we will give you benefit payments based on what you put in down the road when you retire. So this way, we're sort of forcing everybody to contribute to their retirement fund. That's the main idea behind Social Security.
All right, and earlier you referenced the Depression within the Depression, the Depression of 1937-38, whatever we're going to call that. Can you very quickly give more of an explanation of what that was and how that came about?
Sure. So just in terms of the levels of unemployment, it shot back up. I think, it went back from, so the unemployment rate, like I said, it had gotten up to about 25% at its height in the early 30s. Then it was gradually sinking after FDR came in. But then in 1937, the unemployment rate was about 14.3%. And then the next year in 38, it had jumped back up to 19%. Okay, so again, let me just repeat that. Remember, FDR comes in 1933. he wins the 32 election. And so then 5 years later, in 1938, the unemployment rate nationally is still 19%. So again, when people are like trying to assess the legacy of Roosevelt and where his policy is good or not, that's pretty awful if 5 years after you've been in office, the unemployment rate's still 19%. But as to why this happened, there's different theories. So Keynesian economists, who again like to focus on budget deficits and government spending, they're going to say that, what happened was the Roosevelt administration, they started out strong, they were running big deficits, but then they chickened out, right? And they did make a move towards trying to rein in the budget deficit in 37 and 38, and so that's why you saw this relapse in the depression within a depression. People who more focus on monetary policy will say, what happened is the Federal Reserve got worried about inflation, and so they doubled the reserve requirements of banks. So they said that banks had to set aside for a given amount of what customers thought they had in checking account balances. The Fed changed the rules on the banks and said you now have to set aside a higher percentage to have like cash in the vaults to back that up. And they did this this period. And so that's like in a sense tightening. And so that's, they could say that might have been what caused it. I think what happened was this was also when a lot of the New Deal labor legislation went into effect, and it gave unions a lot more power right in this period. And so I think that's what caused the unemployment rate to shoot up. If you had to pick one specific thing, that all of a sudden union strength got bolstered right in this period. And so they raised wage rates, which was good for the union members who kept their jobs, but then it caused unemployment to go up because now labor's more expensive, and so businesses cut back on how much labor they hire.
All right, so two more questions before we wrap up, and the first one is about the end of the Great Depression. Earlier you referenced the claim that World War II brought about the end of the Great Depression. Now, what's wrong with that claim and the general notion of wartime prosperity that goes along with it? And what in reality actually brought about the end of the Great Depression?
Okay, so you're right. That's a very typical explanation. And what's ironic is sometimes the people who say that, the people who say World War II was what ultimately got the U.S. out of the Depression, are actually conservative right-wingers. And so the context is they'll be sort of poo-pooing the credit given to Roosevelt's New Deal and say, no, it wasn't the New Deal, it was the military spending. But that's still a Keynesian explanation, right? So you're not debunking the claim that government spending can fix a bad economy. So conservatives who like to play that card should just realize they're giving away the whole game. If that's what they think, then they're admitting that, it took government expenditures to fix the market economy, which is what the Keynesians have been saying all along. But I think actually that's a totally erroneous theory. So just on the face of it, I mean, it would be a pretty perverse world if when the economy's on the ropes, things are bad, if the way you make it better is you draft millions of your able-bodied men and then send them across the ocean to get shot at or to kill people, and you take a lot of your available scarce resources, instead of making cars and radios and nylon stockings, instead you make tanks and bullets and bombs, things that do nothing but cause destruction. That would be a pretty odd situation or scenario if that's really what you had to do to return prosperity to the home front. And so just superficially on the face of it, that seems crazy. And then if you go and look at the data, you see that it is crazy. So just to give you one example, if you do look at the official government statistics, you will see that the GDP figures do go up sharply during the World War II years. But that's because by definition, the way they run those numbers, if the U.S. government spends $1 billion buying tanks, then they say, economic output just went up by $1 billion. But that's not really a good measure of true economic output, because that's just the government spending money on something. There's no assurance that the government is wisely spending the money. Whereas if households spend collectively $1 billion on radios, that's some notion that, there's $1 billion worth of output there, whatever you want to mean by that, because the households have a limited amount of money and they can spend it how they want. So if they choose to spend on the radios, they must have liked the radios. Whereas it's not nearly the same thing if government officials, get a budget assigned to them and then reward their, the big defense contractors by shoveling money their way. So that's just one example. If you look at private GDP, right? So if you decompose the official figures into the private sector versus the government sector, private GDP per capita, as I said this earlier in the interview, was at its lowest level in the midst of the World War II years. It was even lower than it had been at the depths of the Great Depression. And so, and this lines up anecdotally. I mean, we have, you look at diaries and so forth of the people living on the home front, living through 1942, 1943. It was a very austere time on the home front in the United States. And so, they were saying, hey, there's a war on. We got to cut back because the troops need this stuff overseas. But so the idea that the war somehow caused prosperity is completely erroneous.
All right. So one final question for you. Given that the Great Depression had happened, what would have been the proper solutions as opposed to the New Deal? And what can we learn about this whole time period and the Great Depression and the New Deal and apply to today?
Well, I think that what the U.S. government should have done is what they had done on all previous financial panics or depressions with a small d, is do nothing, right? Or if you want to say do something, the federal government could cut spending and taxes and relieve other government regulations. So again, given that the Federal Reserve had blown up a giant asset bubble in the 20s that needed to have a crash, the economy was on an unsustainable path in the late 20s. But as history had shown, if you just let the market economy work, workers get reallocated, resources get moved around, and things generally, hit rock bottom and then start recovering a few years later. Whereas here, they just did everything they could have to stifle the market's the normal response to a situation like that. So again, even though it's not very politically popular, if Herbert Hoover had actually been the guy that the history books said he was, and he really had just sat back and done nothing, then I think what history would have shown is, the 1929 and 30 depression with a small d would have been real sharp and severe, and it would have been just like the 1920 and 21 depression. Probably most of your listeners didn't even know that there was a depression from 1920 to 21, but there was. The reason we don't know about it is because the government didn't do anything. The government was slashing its budget at the time, coming back off of World War I, and nothing, it doesn't get in the history books because it was so short. But when the government did try to do something about it, that's why we remember it, because then the depression just kept lingering on and on.
Sure. Well, all right. Thank you very much for joining me today. If someone wants to learn more about the Great Depression and the New Deal and related topics, what do you recommend they take a look at, and what are the best ways to follow your work in particular?
Yeah, so my personal website's at consultingbyrpm.com. So if you go there, you can see links to all the different outlets I have for my work. As far as reading on the Great Depression, so obviously I'm going to plug my own book because it does give it's written for the layperson and just gives a nice summary and points to different strands of literature. So that's The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. But also I'd recommend Rothbard's book, which is titled America's Great Depression. If you want to see what's called the market monetarist view, then Scott Sumner's got a book called the Midas Paradox. There's Lionel Robbins actually has a good work on the Great Depression. So I think that's a good. Robert Higgs's work, Crisis and Leviathan, I think is a great thing to look at. And so those are all great places to start if you want to just see the role of government in this era and how there was a massive expansion in government intervention. And I would say that's ultimately the explanation.
All right. Well, I want to encourage everybody to check out the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-depression. And that is the place to go to find all of the resources and readings we've mentioned over the course of this episode. And it's also the place to go to buy the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal, because there will be multiple links on that page to that book so that you can find it easily and purchase it if you would like to read that. Also, there will be links there to America's Great Depression by Rothbard and to the Contra Krugman website and consultingbyrpm.com, everything that we mentioned over the course of this interview. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/great-depression, again, is the show notes page for this episode. And Bob, thanks so much for joining me and for being so generous with your time. I try every time to keep the time down, and most of the time I'm unsuccessful because once we get into it, there are just so many questions and topics that arise that should probably be discussed. So
well,
thanks for helping me to take a look at the Great Depression, the New Deal, and look at where the myths need to be refuted and what the reality actually was. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. We summarized like 25 years of history here, so I think we were pretty good.
Yeah. 25 years of history and about 50-ish minutes or so. That's not a bad ratio. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.